They called her the Ice Queen, not because she was cold, but because nothing could melt her composure. Not the threats, not the blood, not even the men who ruled New York's underworld. She moved through the shadows of Little Italy and the Lower East Side like smoke, untouchable, mysterious, dangerous in her own quiet way. But behind those calculating eyes and diamond-hard smiles was a secret, one that would make her both legendary and hunted. This is the story of Arlyne Brickman, the woman who loved the mob, lived with it, and ultimately destroyed part of it from within. It begins not with power, but with hunger, the kind that doesn't fade when you eat, the kind that lives in your bones, whispering that you deserve more. New York City, 1940s. The air was thick with ambition and the stench of survival. Immigrant families packed into tenements stacked like bricks, chasing that elusive American dream. In the Lower East Side, where the sound of sirens and Sinatra shared the same air, a young girl watched the world through cracked windows and smoky streetlights. Arlyne Brickman wasn't born into power. She was born into chaos. Her father ran a dry cleaning business. Her mother tried to keep the family respectable. But respect in that neighborhood didn't come from clean shirts. It came from fear, from control. From the men who wore silk suits and carried themselves like gods. She'd see them step out of Cadillacs that gleamed like mirrors under the street lamps. They didn't walk, they glided. People moved out of their way without being told. They didn't work ordinary jobs, but they always had cash, always had women, always had respect. To a young girl like Arlyne, growing up surrounded by poverty and limited choices, that power looked divine. While other girls dreamed of movie stars or love stories, Arlyne dreamed of being one of them, a mobster, a player, someone feared and admired all at once. But there was one problem. She was a woman, and in that world, that meant she could never be more than a side character. By her teenage years, Arlyne was already too bold for her neighborhood. She dressed sharp, talked fast, and didn't care what people thought. She'd skip school to hang around the corners where wise guys smoked and joked. She listened to their stories, memorized their mannerisms, studied the rhythm of power. Most of them laughed at her, a pretty kid with attitude, playing gangster. But some saw something else, potential, or maybe just trouble. Either way, they let her stay close enough to watch. She learned early how to use her charm as a weapon. She knew when to flirt, when to flatter, and when to bite back. She wasn't trying to be someone's girlfriend. She was trying to be someone. Every night she'd go home to her cramped apartment, still buzzing from the adrenaline of proximity to danger, imagining what it would be like to run that world instead of just orbiting it. The 1950s were New York's golden age of organized crime. The city pulsed with illegal money, gambling dens, loan sharking, union rackets, heroin pipelines. And at the center of it all were men whose names people whispered with fear and awe. Anastasia, Gallo, Gambino, Colombo. Arlyne drifted between their circles, drawn to anyone who could make her feel powerful. She dated mobsters, drug runners, enforcers, men twice her age who carried guns and called her baby doll. They'd spoil her with furs, jewelry, dinners in dark restaurants where deals were made in code and blood. She became a familiar face in those places, the kind of woman who could hold her liquor and her secrets, and yet behind the laughter and the lipstick, she was studying. Always watching, always calculating. Every man she met became a lesson. Every betrayal, a note in the book of survival. Still, the mob had rules, and the unspoken one was simple. No women in power. Women could be ornaments, distractions, or informants by accident, but never players. The deeper she got, the clearer it became. This world would never truly accept her. By her mid-20s, Arlyne's name was known in the right, or wrong, places. She wasn't feared like a capo or respected like a soldier, but she was recognized. Some called her wild, others called her smart. But all of them underestimated her. She'd started running her own small-time hustles, connecting people, arranging deals, moving money where it needed to go. Nothing major, but enough to keep her in the game. Enough to make her feel alive, but that thrill came with a cost. With every step deeper into the mob's orbit, she lost a little more of herself. The parties, the drugs, the late-night calls, they filled her life with noise but drained it of peace. The men she loved always belonged to someone else, their wives. their bosses, their sins, and when she got pregnant, everything changed. The man she was seeing at the time was a connected guy, smooth, confident, dangerous. When she told him she was carrying his child, his face turned cold. In his world, women like her weren't mothers. They were entertainment. He cut her off without hesitation. The same man who had once sworn she was his everything refused to even look her in the eye. That betrayal cracked something inside her. For years she'd believed that being close to power would protect her. But all it ever did was use her. When her daughter was born, Arlyne realized that her biggest dream had become her biggest cage. She was a single mother in a man's world, surrounded by criminals who respected no one but themselves. But she didn't crumble. She adapted. The Ice Queen began to form, the woman who could smile through heartbreak, lie through fear, and turn pain into purpose. Through the late 1960s and early 70s, Arlyne kept drifting through the mob's shadowy social circles. She was older now, wiser, more dangerous. She had connections in every corner. Drug couriers, bookies, crooked businessmen, even cops on the take. She knew everything about everyone, who was sleeping with who was making side deals, who was cheating the bosses. In another life, she could have been a mob consigliere. But in this one, she was still just a woman surviving on the margins of power, and yet that survival came with its own quiet strength. She knew how to disappear, how to manipulate, how to endure. The same world that rejected her had also trained her, sharpened her instincts, hardened her heart, and prepared her for something she didn't even know was coming. Because somewhere out there, her fate was waiting. And it wasn't with the men who had once owned her loyalty. It was with the people who wanted to destroy them. Years later, when Arlyne Brickman sat across from the FBI for the first time, she thought back to those early years. The glamour, the chaos, the thrill. She thought about the men who made her feel like she was part of something bigger, only to leave her broken and disposable. And in that moment, she understood something powerful. The only way to beat the mob was to become their reflection. That cold composure, that fearlessness. It wasn't just an act. It was armor. And soon she would need every ounce of it, because the same men who once kissed her hand would soon want her head. The Ice Queen's war was about to begin. The Lower East Side never slept. Even in the dead of night it hummed, a restless pulse made of neon, sirens, and whispers that carried through the cracked alleys and crooked fire escapes. For Arlyne Brickman, that pulse was home. It was the sound of opportunity, the rhythm of survival. Every streetlight felt like a stage light, every shadow a curtain waiting to be pulled back. She grew up surrounded by hustlers, kids who learned early that you could either work for scraps or take what you wanted. Respect wasn't handed down by birthright. It was taken with fists, fear, or finesse. And for a girl like Arlyne, finesse was her weapon. Her mother tried to keep her clean, dragging her to church on Sundays, warning her about those men who wore suits like armor. But the more she was warned, the more curious she became. Because those men didn't beg for respect. They commanded it. They could walk into a crowded diner and silence the room just by lighting a cigarette. That kind of power intoxicated her. Arlyne wanted that. Not the life of the women who clung to those men, but the life of the men themselves. She didn't want to stand behind them. She wanted to stand among them. But in that world, she was invisible, unless someone wanted to use her. By 16, she'd stopped pretending to be the good girl her parents hoped for. She cut class, started hanging out near Mulberry Street, where the smell of espresso mixed with the stench of racketeering. She'd sit at the counter of Angelo's cafe, nursing a cup of coffee she couldn't afford, just to overhear the conversations. Guys in sharkskin suits talked in half sentences, never finishing a thought, never saying names. But Arlyne listened like a detective. Every shrug, every coded phrase, every sly grin told her something. She learned to read them, how they hid fear behind jokes, how they tested loyalty with silence. One of the older guys, Frankie the Fox, took notice. He was slick, a mid-level enforcer with too much charm and not enough conscience. He liked to tease her, calling her the little reporter. But unlike the others, he didn't push her away. He'd buy her coffee, tell her stories about the business, about money, about the life. She hung on every word. Frankie became her first real connection to that forbidden world. He'd let her tag along when he ran errands, made her feel like she belonged to something secret, something dangerous. She started dressing like the women she saw on his arm, Pencil skirts, bright lipstick, perfume heavy enough to leave a trail behind her. It wasn't long before she was running small errands for him, delivering envelopes, relaying messages, playing lookout during street deals. She wasn't paid much, but it wasn't about the money. It was about access. Every errand was a door into a world most people only saw in newspapers and nightmares. Her parents didn't understand. They saw their daughter slipping away, staying out late, coming home with bruised knuckles and a stare that didn't blink anymore. They yelled, they begged, they threatened. But how do you reason with someone addicted to adrenaline? By 18, Arlyne moved out. She found a small apartment with paper-thin walls and a view of nothing, but it didn't matter. The streets were her real home. She started dating a small-time gambler named Joey Russo, charming, reckless, and doomed from the start. Joey wasn't made, but he wanted to be. He idolized the same men she did. Together, they were like two moths flying toward the same flame, daring it to burn them. They'd spend nights in smoky backrooms of social clubs, surrounded by laughter that always sounded one drink away from violence. Arlyne watched the men gamble, argue, strike deals. She memorized their tells, the twitch of a hand before a lie, the half-second pause before a threat, and slowly, she started to find her own voice among them. When Joey got into debt, it was Arlyne who smoothed things over. When someone needed a favor done quietly, she was the one they trusted to handle it. Not because they respected her, but because she was invisible, and that made her useful. She was 21 when she got her first real taste of the darker side of that life. Joey had borrowed money from a Shylock connected to the Colombo family, more than he could ever pay back. When the collectors came, Joey panicked. He begged Arlyne to help, to talk to the guy who handled the loans. The meeting was in a basement beneath a candy store, the kind of place where laughter and screams could sound the same. Arlyne walked in terrified but hid it behind a smile. The man she met, Tony, the Hand DeLuca, looked at her like she was out of her mind for being there. "What's a doll like you doing in this mess?" he asked, leaning back in his chair. "Cleaning it up," she shot back. Something about her tone made him pause. He expected tears or pleading. Instead, she offered a deal, a small payment up front, with her vouching for Joey until he got back on his feet. It was reckless, maybe even stupid, but it worked. Tony laughed and waved her off. "Fine," he said. "You got guts, kid. But don't mistake my mercy for weakness." That night, as she walked out of that basement, her knees were shaking. But she also felt alive in a way she never had before. She'd just negotiated with a man who scared grown men speechless. She realized something powerful. Fear was currency, and she had just learned how to spend it. From that moment, Arlyne's role in the underworld began to shift. She was no longer just a girlfriend or a messenger. She became a problem solver, a connector, someone who could make introductions or smooth out tensions. She wasn't a maid woman. There was no such thing. But she was in the game. Her name started to circulate quietly through backroom whispers. "You need something handled? Call Arlyne. She can get you what you need, and no questions asked," and she loved it. Every deal, every late-night meeting, every secret conversation fed her hunger. But it also deepened her entanglement. The mob was like quicksand, seductive and deadly. Once you stepped in far enough, it didn't let you go. By the late 1950s, she was rubbing shoulders with bigger players, men tied to the Colombo and Gambino families. Some treated her like a novelty, others like a liability. But most underestimated her. That was her advantage. She learned that the most dangerous thing in that world wasn't the gun. It was information. Who owed who? Who cheated who? Who was falling out of favor? Arlyne became a collector of secrets. But for all the power she tasted, she could never escape the reminder that she was still an outsider. The men she helped rise wouldn't even let her in the room when decisions were made. She could influence, suggest, persuade, but she could never command. The world she loved would never love her back. Sometimes, late at night, she'd sit by her window and stare at the city lights. Each one a story, a lie, a deal gone wrong. She'd light a cigarette and think about the future. Was this it? Was this all there was? Being the woman behind the curtain, watching men play the roles she could never have? She told herself it was enough, that the thrill, the danger, the money made it worth it. But deep down, she knew something was missing, a piece of herself that the mob had taken without asking. And soon, Life would remind her just how cruel that world could be. Because in the Mafia, loyalty wasn't love. It was leverage. And the moment she stopped being useful, they'd show her exactly where she stood. But for now, Arlyne Brickman was still standing. Sharper, bolder, hungrier than ever. The streets had shaped her into something neither her family nor her enemies could have imagined. A woman who didn't fear power. A woman who understood it. A woman who was about to use it in ways no one saw coming. The 1960s glittered like a mirage, all neon lights and velvet dreams. But for those who lived in the mob's shadow, it was a dangerous illusion. The city might have been changing, new clubs, new sounds, new temptations, but the rules of the streets hadn't. Power still came from fear, loyalty was still currency, and betrayal. Well, betrayal was still a death sentence. For Arlyne Brickman, this was her time. She'd spent her youth clawing for a seat at the table, and now she had one, even if she wasn't supposed to. She wasn't a boss or a soldier, not officially. But her phone rang when things went wrong, and her name carried quiet weight in backroom whispers. She was the woman who could get things done, no questions asked. By her 30s, Arlyne had perfected her role in the mob's social ecosystem. She was the go-between, the elegant messenger who could smooth over conflicts between jealous mistresses, angry girlfriends, or rival associates. She wasn't armed, but she didn't need to be. Her weapon was her presence, confident, composed, unreadable. They called her Ice Queen behind her back, but she liked the sound of it. In a world ruled by hot-headed men, being cold kept her alive. Her apartment was a shrine to the life she'd built. The kind of place where the air always smelled of Chanel and cigarette smoke. Furs lined the closet, jewelry glimmered on her dresser, and the refrigerator was filled not with food, but with bottles of champagne. She'd learned long ago that image was everything. If she looked untouchable, people would believe she was. The nights were endless. One evening, she'd be dining in Little Italy with the Colombos. The next, she'd be laughing over cocktails with a crew tied to the Gambinos. Everyone wanted her company because she was unpredictable, loyal to no one, yet trusted by everyone. Arlyne had a way of making men feel like they were in control when, really, she was the one steering the conversation. She could flirt just enough to disarm them, listen just long enough to make them talk, and then walk away with more information than she gave. She was never sloppy, never emotional, but beneath the surface, something darker was brewing. Power, she realized, was like addiction. The more you had, the more you needed. And in the mob, that craving could kill you. It started with favors, small ones. A friend needed help moving cash from one operation to another. Another needed a message delivered to a guy in Queens. Then came introductions, setups, and deals. Arlyne wasn't running a crew, but she was part of the bloodstream now, facilitating moves that made men rich and ruined others. She told herself she wasn't breaking any laws. She was just helping. But deep down, she knew better. And then came the drugs. At first, it was just a party thing. Cocaine, pills, whatever the night demanded. It was the price of keeping up, of numbing the constant tension that came with living two lives. But addiction in that world wasn't just about substances. It was about identity. About wanting to belong so badly you'd destroy yourself to prove you deserved to be there. Arlyne's relationships became more complicated too. The men she attracted were powerful, married, dangerous. They adored her, until they didn't. To them, she was a fantasy, a distraction from their brutal reality. But the moment she stepped out of line, the warmth vanished. One of them, a high-ranking enforcer named Salvatore, was the worst. He treated her like property, like something he could show off and shove aside. When she tried to walk away, he reminded her what walking away meant. "You don't leave me," he said one night, his voice cold, his hand on her throat. "Not unless I say so." That night, when she finally broke free and locked herself in her bathroom, staring at the blood on her lip, Arlyne saw the truth. No amount of money or luxury could hide what she was in their eyes. Disposable. But she didn't cry. She didn't call for help. She just stared at herself in the mirror until the tears burned away, until the reflection staring back looked calm again. Ice Queen, always in control. That was the moment she made a silent promise. She'd never let another man in that world break her again. The years rolled on and the city's underworld began to shift. The old families were still strong, but new players were rising. The drug trade, the counterfeiting rings, the hustlers who didn't play by the old rules. Arlyne adapted. She always did. She started running her own quiet side operations, connecting low-level dealers with suppliers, taking a cut from introductions, sometimes storing cash or contraband for a fee. Nothing major, but enough to make her feel like she wasn't just orbiting power anymore. She was holding it. People noticed. Not the bosses, not yet, but the street guys, the ones who saw her at clubs, who heard her name dropped in the right conversations. They knew she was more than just another mob girlfriend. There was a night, one that would stick with her forever. When she walked into a club on Mulberry Street wearing a white dress that caught the light like frost. The room went quiet. Every man turned. Every woman whispered. She wasn't the prettiest in the room, but she had something else. Presence. One of the guys joked, "Here comes the Ice Queen. Careful. She'll freeze your heart before she breaks it." Arlyne smiled, slow and deliberate. "Only if it's worth breaking," she said. The laughter that followed wasn't mocking. It was respectful. For the first time, she felt it. Real, tangible respect. Maybe not as a boss, but as something rarer. A woman the mob actually feared a little. But with every rise comes a fall. Arlyne's growing independence made her dangerous in ways she didn't realize. Whispers started to spread. That she knew too much. That she was getting too close to certain family secrets. That maybe she was working both sides. In the Mafia, rumors were as deadly as bullets. The drugs didn't help. The partying got heavier, the nights longer, the mornings colder. Sometimes she'd wake up not remembering how she got home. Sometimes she'd find bruises she couldn't explain. The Ice Queen was cracking, and no one noticed, or cared. Then came the pregnancy. The man responsible was one of her high-ranking lovers. Someone powerful, someone untouchable. When she told him, expecting maybe anger or panic, he just stared at her with contempt. "You think I'm going to take care of you now? You think you're special?" The words hit harder than any slap. He tossed her a few bills, told her to handle it, and walked away like she was nothing. In that moment, all the illusions shattered. The suits, the champagne, the diamonds, none of it meant power. None of it meant respect. She was just another pawn in their empire of lies. But this time she wasn't going to cry about it. This time she was going to remember it. When her daughter was born, everything changed. Holding that baby in her arms, Arlyne felt something she hadn't felt in years. Clarity. The world she lived in wasn't just toxic. It was lethal. And if she stayed in it, it would swallow her child too. She tried to pull back, to step away from the lifestyle. But walking away from the mob isn't like quitting a job. It's like trying to leave a cult that's buried its claws in your soul. The phone still rang. People still showed up at her door asking for favors. She was still the woman who knew too much. But she was different now. The Ice Queen had purpose. She'd play the game a little longer, but this time, she'd do it on her terms. She'd smile at the same men who betrayed her, drink with them, laugh with them, all while quietly building the resolve to one day turn their power against them. It wasn't revenge yet. Not quite. But it was coming. Because when you take everything from a woman who's already lived through hell, what's left is something far more dangerous than hate. Clarity. And clarity was exactly what would make Arlyne Brickman one of the most unlikely enemies the Mafia ever had. The 1970s were a strange time for the Mafia. The old codes were breaking down and the streets were changing faster than anyone could control. The old-school bosses were either dead or locked up, and a new generation was taking over. One that didn't care about the rules, one that was greedy, loud, and reckless. The golden age of loyalty and omerta was fading, replaced by cocaine, paranoia, and chaos. Arlyne Brickman was in her 40s now. She'd survived decades in a world that devoured people twice as tough as her. The Ice Queen still had her charm, but the shine was wearing off. The nights were longer, the mornings harder. The faces in the bars were younger, hungrier, and more dangerous. She'd become a relic in a business that didn't value relics. The same men who once sought her advice now smirked when she walked into a room. To them, she was an old story, a reminder of a time when the mob still had class. The new wise guys didn't care about class. They cared about money, and the fastest way to make it was through drugs. Arlyne had tried to keep her distance from narcotics, but cocaine had become the new currency of nightlife. It was everywhere, In clubs, in cars, in the bathrooms of high-end restaurants where deals were whispered and lives were ruined. And she wasn't immune. The woman who once prided herself on control began to lose her grip. It started innocently, a line at a party, a hit to keep the night going. But soon it became a crutch. The drugs dulled the noise, silenced the memories, blurred the edges of guilt. They also made her reckless. Her connections in the underworld still respected her enough to bring her in on low-risk operations, deliveries, introductions, small payouts. But that life was starting to feel empty. The glamour had turned to grit. The faces around her weren't the suave mobsters of her youth anymore. They were jittery, paranoid street dealers with hollow eyes and twitching hands. She would sit at bars late into the night, watching the world she helped build decay around her. The jokes were meaner, the music louder, the women younger, and every so often, a familiar face would turn up dead. The mob was eating itself. One night, Arlyne was leaving a club on Mott Street when she saw something that shook her to her core. A young woman, barely 20, stumbled out of the alley behind her, blood trickling down her face. Two men followed, laughing. One of them Arlyne recognized. He was a low-level thug who worked for a guy she used to date. Arlyne froze as the girl collapsed onto the pavement. She wanted to help, but the rules of the street screamed louder than her conscience. You didn't interfere. You didn't see anything. You didn't speak. The next morning, the papers mentioned nothing. Just another nameless girl who got mixed up with the wrong crowd. But Arlyne couldn't shake it. That image, the broken body, the laughter, the indifference, haunted her. It was like looking into a mirror of her own past, a warning she could no longer ignore. That was the night she decided she was done being a spectator, but leaving the life wasn't simple. Every time she tried to distance herself, someone pulled her back in. A phone call, a favor, a threat. The mob had long memories and longer claws. And even if she wasn't a major player anymore, she still knew things. Names, dates, operations. That made her both valuable and dangerous. Around that time, she got word that the FBI was tightening its grip on organized crime. Agents were tailing wise guys, bugging phones, flipping low-level associates. It was only a matter of time before someone in her orbit went down. And if they did, her name would come up. She tried to clean up her act, but the damage was done. Her reputation was in free fall, her savings were gone, and her so-called friends had vanished. The same men who once called her baby now called her trouble. She was drifting toward the edge, and the city she once ruled from the shadows no longer had a place for her. Then came the breaking point. It started with a phone call. A woman, someone she'd known for years, a mistress to one of the higher-ups, was hysterical. She'd been beaten badly by her boyfriend, a mid-level enforcer who thought he could do whatever he wanted. She begged Arlyne for help, said she had nowhere else to go. Arlyne hesitated. She knew getting involved was a mistake, but she couldn't say no. Maybe she saw herself in that woman. Maybe she just couldn't stand watching another life get chewed up by the same machine that almost destroyed hers. When Arlyne confronted the man, he laughed in her face. "You think you can tell me how to handle my woman?" he said. "You ain't part of this life anymore, sweetheart." Something in her snapped. For years, she'd swallowed her pride, pretended to play along, kept her head down. But now she was done being invisible. She spat the words back at him. "You think you're untouchable? You'll see how fast the feds touch you." It was a reckless threat, said in anger. But it was also the first time she'd spoken out loud the thought that had been circling her mind for months. Maybe the only way to survive this world was to turn against it. Days later, she noticed a black car following her home. Then the hang-up call started. She knew what it meant. Someone had heard what she said. The underworld had no patience for loose tongues. She started sleeping with a knife under her pillow, jumping at every knock on the door. The Ice Queen who once ruled the night was now a ghost, hiding behind her own curtains, and that's when the FBI came knocking. It was almost poetic. For years, she'd lived in fear of those three letters, and now they were offering her a way out. The agents who approached her weren't the stereotypical hardliners she expected. They were patient, almost kind. They told her they knew who she was, that she could help them bring down real monsters. "You're not one of them," one of them said softly. "You never were." That line hit her harder than she wanted to admit. Because deep down, she'd always known it was true. She'd tried to be part of their world. but it was never truly hers. They offered her protection, money, a chance to start over, in exchange for one thing: information. Arlyne didn't answer right away. She needed time. She spent days pacing her apartment, replaying her life like a film reel. Every betrayal, every insult, every bruise came rushing back. The men she'd loved, the friends she'd buried, the fear she'd lived with for too long. And then she thought of her daughter. Innocent, bright, untouched by the darkness that had consumed her mother's life. What kind of future could she have if the same men who ran these streets still held power? Arlyne lit a cigarette, staring out her window at the city skyline, that jagged crown of light and shadow. She'd spent her whole life chasing power, and now, for the first time, she had a chance to own it. Not through manipulation, not through seduction, but through truth. The mob had used her, lied to her, broken her. Now she was going to return the favor. When the agents came back a week later, she didn't hesitate. "I'll do it," she said. "But if I'm going to burn their house down, I want to make sure they feel every spark." That night, as she lay awake, a strange calm washed over her. She knew what she was stepping into. The Mafia didn't forgive betrayal. It erased it. But she wasn't afraid anymore. For years, she'd been a pawn, a plaything, a name whispered behind laughter. Now, she was about to become something else entirely, a weapon. Arlyne Brickman, the Ice Queen, had just crossed the line from survivor to traitor. And once you cross that line, there's no turning back. There are moments in a life that feel like doors closing, sudden, loud, irrevocable. For Arlyne Brickman, the door didn't slam. It creaked open with the nervous politeness of a government office, with a thin man in a cheap suit who smelled faintly of coffee and antiseptic. He offered a folder and a promise. Neither would keep her safe. The FBI didn't show up in flares and dramatics. They arrived in the soft, efficient way institutions do. Paperwork, badges, names repeated until they seemed ordinary. Arlyne had imagined interrogation rooms her whole life, a child's fantasy of heroes and villains. What she found instead were men and women who spoke of cases and indictments like doctors discussing charts. They were less about glory and more about grinding patience. They wanted details, names, dates, routes, the small habits that made a crime family tick. They wanted her voice on tape. At first she laughed at the offer. It felt obscene. The Mafia she'd loved, the men who had fed and used her, and the same system that had once been the enemy now proposing a kind of salvation. "Why would I help you?" she asked, and the agent shrugged the way someone might shrug off a triviality. "Because you can make them fall," he said. "Because you want out." She weighed it the only way she knew how, like a ledger. On one side, the life she had with the glamour turned to ash. The beatings, the betrayals, the hang-up calls that turned to threats. The black cars that followed her like vultures. On the other, an uncertain future under a different name, protection for her daughter, a chance to turn the power she'd collected back on the men who'd used it. It was a deal with the devil. And like most deals with devils, it came wrapped in small print and a smile. She would be an informant. She would wear a wire. She would testify if necessary. The government would relocate her, give her money, change her life on paper. In return, she would hand over the scraps of a world she'd once worshipped. Her first instinct was to tell them to go to hell. Loyalty, after all, is not something you throw away on the spot, even if it has been measured and found wanting. But loyalty had never been returned. It had been spent. The memory of the young woman in the alley, the laughter that had shredded a life in a night, was a hot coal behind her ribs. She thought of her daughter asleep in a room that smelled of baby powder and yesterday's cigarette smoke. She thought of the men who taught her how to be invisible, who never once made her feel safe. On a rainy afternoon, in a booth at a diner where the booths were sticky and the coffee was real, she signed. She didn't read every line. She trusted the calculation she'd made more than any lawyer's prose. The world she'd known was ending, and the only thing she could carry forward was her own will. Becoming an informant is part decision, part theater. The FBI trained her like a reluctant recruit. They taught her how to handle a wire, where to tuck the mic so it wouldn't chafe, how to speak naturally despite the coppery buzz of a recorder pressed against her ribs. They rehearsed conversations until they were banal, taught her what to say and what to avoid. They promised backup, safe houses, an emergency number she could call if she smelled trouble. relocation plans if things blew up. They also offered a kind of moral framing. You were not betraying family, they said. You were helping to stop crimes and occasionally to save lives. That framing didn't make it easier. The hardest part was not the mechanics but the duplicity. For the first time, Arlyne would have to live with two faces that had to be perfect fits. The one that laughed with the mob at dinners and the one that whispered secrets into a recorder under a blouse. Every meeting had the electric, nauseating possibility of being the last. Every kiss, every hand on hers might be a trap. Her life turned into a tightrope walk over an abyss, and her balance was measured in breaths. She also had to train her emotions. She who had flirted for information now had to perform attachment without feeling it. She who had been burned by men had to feign trust when necessary. The irony was sharpened by self-awareness. She had used charm as a weapon for years. Now charm would be her shield, but aimed at both sides. She would make the mob comfortable while she eroded it. And she would make the agents believe she was steady while she played dangerous games in rooms thick with smoke. Early assignments were small and surgical. She'd meet a courier in a diner, wearing her wire under a heavy sweater, and let him speak long enough to say names. She'd sit at poker nights and let the camera capture a string of casual confessions. The recordings were never cinematic. They were banal and human. The clink of ice in a glass, a voice lowered to gossip, a laugh that eased the conscience. Those ordinary sounds became ammunition. The agents studied them like archivists, cataloging phrases and mapping associations. Each tape she handed over echoed in her mind like a betrayal. She pictured the faces of men she'd once loved, the way they called her baby, and smiled like they meant it. She pictured the daughters they ignored, the women left in alleys. But with each name she gave, roofs came down on illegal operations. Small-time dealers were taken off streets, and the city, the only honest city she had ever known, felt for a moment less suffocating. There were moments of triumph that felt curiously empty. One spring night, a team took down a drug ring after one of her recordings gave the agents the missing puzzle piece. Watching the raid on the TV in the safe house, she felt a cold surge of vindication and a hollow absence. The streets that applauded the spectacle were unaware of the price paid by a woman who had to keep smiling for the cameras while listening to men boast about bodies and money. And then the other shoe dropped. The mob hates a traitor like a fever hates a body. Rumors have teeth. They bite at reputations and then at throats. It didn't take long for whispers to travel. A loose-lipped bartender, an observed glance, a careless comment at a club. Suddenly the things she had once taken for granted, the nod from a doorman, the way a familiar car slowed, became threats. Paranoia wrapped around her like a second skin. She altered her routes, slept in different beds, started dressing down so as not to be noticed. Even with federal protection, fear carved out its niche in her bones. She'd sit for hours holding the phone, imagining the worst. Every stranger's stance, every late-night engine noise had the potential to be the sound of a hit team. Her life shrank to the size of a telephone line, but the heat she brought to the mob also brought consequences. Men were indicted. Men were arrested. Some of them were big names whose disappearances echoed through the underworld like distant thunder. When a capo was led away in cuffs because of a conversation she'd recorded about a cash route, Arlyne felt a sick whirl of victory and remorse. She had done it. She had the proof. But the image of men she once dined with in cheap back rooms, being hauled into fluorescent-lit interrogation rooms, didn't feel like justice so much as the end of a world that had given her both thrills and wounds. There were times she wanted desperately to confess. Everything. To tell the agents how much she missed the old world's perverse grace. To tell the mob that she regretted the hurt she'd caused. She tamped those impulses down. Regret is a dangerous currency when your life is at stake. She learned to fold it into quiet cigarettes and whispered prayers. Her daughter became the lodestar of every choice. Seeing the girl grow, seeing her laugh without the dull filter of fear, hardened Arlyne's resolve. If turning on the mob could buy even a sliver of safety for that child, then the duplicity was a debt she was willing to pay. The FBI promised a new life, maybe in a small town with a new name on a lease and a different schoolyard. It was enough to stop hesitation from morphing into paralysis, yet the act of betrayal is never clean or absolute. There were nights she found herself back in old haunts, letting nostalgia wash over her as she sat with men she had betrayed and ate the cheap lies they fed her. She treasured those moments like contraband, a reminder that she could still play the part even while tearing the stage apart. The Ice Queen was a master at illusion, and she would need every trick she had left. The turning point did not feel dramatic in the cinematic sense. There were no last-minute speeches, no dramatic music swelling as she sealed her fate. It was quieter, a signature on a sheet of paper, a taped conversation that would later be played in a courtroom, a whispered instruction to take care of a child. But that quiet carried a weight that would ripple across years. Arlyne's life became a ledger of recorded moments, court dates, and a series of close calls. It was brutal and slow, an erosion rather than an explosion. When arrests started happening, when old friends were dragged into interrogation rooms, when the neighborhood that had been her cathedral turned on her in small, stone-cold ways, she felt the full gravity of what she'd chosen. She had done what she had to do. She had made the deal with the devil, and, for a time, kept faith that the government's promise of protection would be enough. She had become both the instrument of justice and the focus of vengeance. And in the hush between raids and courtroom testimony, she began to understand the cruel economy of power, that to take it back, she would have to pay with pieces of herself she might never get back. The Ice Queen had put a price on her own life. She would collect, and she would be collected. The irony wasn't lost on Arlyne Brickman. She had spent decades mastering the art of loyalty in a world built on betrayal, and now she was the very thing that world despised most, a rat. The word carried venom in every corner of the underworld, more deadly than a bullet, more shameful than defeat. A rat dies alone, they used to say. Arlyne knew it better than anyone. But what they never said out loud, what she was learning now, was how heavy the silence before that death could feel. The transformation was subtle at first. The agents told her to keep living normally, to stay connected to her old life so her cover wouldn't be blown. But normal was a word that no longer meant anything. Every interaction became theater. Every phone call felt like a test. Every embrace felt like a countdown. The underworld had sharp instincts. It could smell weakness, hesitation, guilt. And guilt was something Arlyne had in abundance. Her first few weeks as an informant were chaos wrapped in calm. She'd go out to clubs, smile, dance, pour drinks, and all the while her mind was a battlefield. The small black wire pressed against her chest was a reminder that the walls had ears. Her ears. She had to remember every name, every deal mentioned, every passing joke that might contain a clue. But she also had to appear natural, as if she wasn't collecting evidence against men who would slit her throat without hesitation if they found out. The FBI handlers admired her nerve. "You've got steel in your veins," one of them said after a particularly close call. She smiled, but inside she felt hollow. Steel rusts, she thought, and fear corrodes faster than time. There was one man who complicated everything, Joey the Saint Galenti. The nickname was a joke, of course. He was no saint. He was a mid-level enforcer with eyes like a winter storm, calm and cruel all at once. Arlyne had known him for years. He'd flirted with her when she was younger, half in admiration, half in calculation. Now, older and wiser, he treated her with a strange mix of nostalgia and suspicion. He'd started showing up at the clubs where she went, lingering too long, asking too many questions. "Funny seeing you around again," he said one night, leaning close so the music swallowed his voice. "I live here," she replied coolly, flicking ash from her cigarette. "You're the one who disappeared." He smirked. "I never disappear, sweetheart. I just watch who does." That line stuck with her long after he walked away. She didn't know if it was a threat or a confession. Probably both. The agents warned her about him. Joey was old school, sharp, loyal to no one but himself. If anyone would smell something off, it was him. Arlyne had to be careful. But care and fear are twin poisons. Too much of either can paralyze. And Arlyne had never been the type to freeze. She played her role perfectly. She let Joey believe she was tired, bitter, fading into irrelevance. That kind of story was easy to sell. Half of it was true. But every time he leaned in close, every time his voice dropped into a whisper about some new shipment, some upcoming deal, she knew the tiny wire beneath her dress was capturing the end of an empire. The recordings grew more dangerous. The men around her were getting reckless. Cocaine had made them sloppy, and paranoia made them cruel. They suspected everyone, outsiders, waitresses, even their own wives. The FBI wanted her to keep pushing, to stay embedded as long as she could. But each night the risk grew sharper. Arlyne began to feel like she was walking barefoot through broken glass, no matter how carefully she moved. Eventually she would bleed, then one night, it happened. She was at a backroom party in Brooklyn, filled with smoke, liquor, and laughter that sounded too loud to be real. A fight broke out between two soldiers, a deal gone wrong, accusations flying, chairs splintering. In the chaos, someone bumped into Arlyne hard enough that her blouse shifted. Joey saw it, the glint of wire, the faint outline of metal beneath fabric. His eyes narrowed for half a second, then relaxed, as if he'd decided not to believe what he'd seen. But the seed was planted. Later that night, as she slipped out into the cold air, Joey followed her. "Hey," he called softly. She turned, heart pounding. He stood under a flickering streetlight, a cigarette glowing between his fingers. "You know, you've changed," he said, smoke curling from his mouth like the whisper of a secret. "Used to be you couldn't stand being around rats. Now you look like one." Her breath caught. For a split second she thought about running. Then she did what she always did. She smiled. "Maybe you're just paranoid," she said. "Everyone's a rat in this town. Even you." He laughed, too loud, and flicked his cigarette into the gutter. "Maybe," he said. "But remember, sweetheart, paranoia keeps me alive." He turned and walked away, and she stood there trembling, every nerve on fire. She didn't know if he'd guessed or if he was just toying with her. But she knew this. Her time was running out. The FBI wanted her to pull back after that night. They said it was too risky, that one more slip-up could get her killed. But Arlyne refused. "I'm already in it," she said. "If I stop now, they'll smell blood." She wasn't wrong. The mob was on edge, and any sudden move would confirm their suspicions. So she stayed and pushed harder. Over the next few months, she recorded hours of incriminating conversations. Drug deals, extortion rackets, laundering operations. It was all there. The evidence she gathered would later bring down several major figures in New York's organized crime network. But at the time, all it brought her was insomnia and fear. She started drinking again. Not for fun, for courage. A glass of gin before every meeting, a shot before every wired encounter. It dulled the panic, made her voice steadier. But it also blurred her edges. The agents noticed. "You're slipping," one of them warned. "I'm surviving," she shot back. "There's a difference." Still, she couldn't hide the exhaustion forever. The constant lying, the double life, the loneliness, it ate at her. She couldn't tell her friends. She couldn't trust anyone. Even her daughter, innocent and bright, sensed something was wrong. "Mommy, why do you look sad all the time?" she asked one morning. Arlyne smiled and said it was nothing, but inside she felt her heart splinter. Then came the betrayal within the betrayal. It was an ordinary day when the call came. One of her handlers, the only one she halfway trusted, told her to meet in a different location than usual. "Change of plans," he said casually. She went, thinking nothing of it, only to find two new faces waiting for her in a parked car. No smiles, no warmth. They weren't there to thank her. They were there to warn her. Someone inside the bureau had leaked. Her file, her name, might be compromised. It was the kind of gut punch that leaves you dizzy. For months, she had risked her life feeding information to the government, and now the same system that promised to protect her had left a hole in the fence. She wanted to scream, to hit something, to demand answers. But instead she sat there silent while they told her to lay low for a while. Lay low. As if that meant anything in her world. That night she didn't sleep. She sat by the window, gun in her lap, watching headlights crawl across the ceiling. She kept thinking of Joey, of the way he'd looked at her that night, like he already knew. Maybe he'd been told. Maybe someone at the bureau had said too much. Or maybe, she thought bitterly, it didn't matter. The mob always found out eventually. The paranoia grew unbearable. Every knock on the door made her jump. Every shadow looked like a threat. The agents moved her to a safe house, but even there she couldn't relax. Safety felt like an illusion, like another lie she was selling to herself. One evening she stood in front of the mirror and barely recognized the woman staring back. The Ice Queen was gone. In her place was someone older, haunted, stripped of glamour and certainty. But behind the fear, there was still something fierce, a spark that refused to die. She whispered to her reflection, "They made me this way. Now they'll pay for it." That was when she decided to go all in. No half measures, no caution. She would burn everything down, even if it meant burning herself with it. The walls of loyalty had crumbled long ago. Now there was only survival, and in that survival, Arlyne Brickman found her last truth. In a world built on betrayal, the only way to win is to betray better than anyone else. When the first indictment hit the papers, it felt like a small, distant thunder, the kind of noise that people in other parts of the city noticed, but which for a long time didn't touch Arlyne's life. Then the thunder moved closer. Then it cracked like a rifle shot. Men she'd once laughed with were cuffed. Clubs where she danced went quiet. The neighborhood that had been a mosaic of faces turned into a field of eyes. Narrowed, searching, accusatory. She had known the risk. She had signed the papers, tucked the wire, whispered names into a recorder with the steady voice of someone who had rehearsed courage. But theory and reality are estranged cousins. In practice, the cost of betrayal is searing and immediate. The underworld does not forget. It accumulates grudges like a beast accumulates hunger, and vengeance is its most patient tooth. It began with small things meant to unsettle, a flat tire on a rainy night, a brick through the window of a building she owned, a stranger who lingered too long at a corner and then vanished. Each incident alone might be shrugged off. Together they were a punctuation, a sentence being slowly written. She felt it in the air, in the way the mailman no longer made eye contact, in the way friends' hugs grew brief and mechanical. The world she had navigated for decades was closing its doors. People she thought were friends avoided her. The safe smiles were gone. A silence larger than the city settled around her. Men she had once protected with favors now passed by without recognition. Where once there had been nods, now there were pauses. And behind those pauses, calculus. Who had been quiet to save themselves? Who had needed to be seen not talking to her? The social network dissolved into a grid of self-preservation. Rumors spread along the same channels she had used for years, but this time their edges were knives. She sang. She ratted. She's the reason Tony got picked up. The words stung because they were true, and because they came with faces that had once admired her, now contorted with hatred. Insults, threats, whispers. They all arrived in the same voice, the same rhythm, the underworld's chorus for traitors. More dangerous was the practical response. Men began to talk about her in meetings that were once casual. Men who had no moral stake in anything but their safety started discussing the idea of teaching lessons. It's not that they all agreed on murder. It's that they agreed someone had to be made an example of. Fear is a currency, and the Mafia invested in it liberally. She knew she was marked. The knowledge landed like a physical blow, a taut silence in her chest, a ringing behind her ears. She took precautions, different cars, alternate routes, lights on timers in apartments she hadn't lived in for years. The FBI increased surveillance for a while. Agents shadowed her like grim angels. But protection is never perfect, and the sense of mortal exposure never quite left. Arlyne moved into safe houses, then moved again when the heat leaked. The relocations became a dizzying carousel. New names, new identities on paper. She learned to sleep on couches with one eye open, to judge the safety of a room by the way the door closed. Little rituals grew, checking peepholes 3 times before opening a door, always carrying a small knife, never allowing a hand to rest on the table where she ate. Each habit was a talisman against panic, but practical survival couldn't inoculate her against the psychological aftermath. Being hunted is a loneliness that goes beyond being alone. It is a condition where every reflection yields a stranger, where the people you loved become potential threats, where laughter becomes a hush and music becomes a countdown. Her daughter's face was the only antidote, the only light that refused to be dimmed by terror, and being away from her was part of the punishment. She watched her child play in parks that might as well have been worlds apart. There were moments when she would tuck the child into bed and press a kiss to a forehead that smelled like crayons and apples, and the world would seem salvageable. Then she would remember a name she'd recorded the week before, a voice that would soon be brought to heel, and the nausea would return. The consequence was a life divided into stolen family moments, and the constant calculus of who deserved protection. Friends, who had no choice but to abandon her still, tried to send messages in the language of caution. A former lover would grind his cigarette in the gutter and offer a look that meant both regret and warning. A bartender in a shop on Bleecker would leave the light on at the back just so she could slip in without being noticed. These were small mercies, scraps that tasted like kindness, though they couldn't fill the empty spaces. They were reminders that loyalty had not been universal. It had been rationed. The physical threats grew bolder. One night, as she walked through a quiet stretch toward the subway, a man stepped from an alcove as if conjured. He was broad-shouldered, face half hidden in the hood of his jacket. Panic flared like gasoline. The man moved without overt aggression, but with a clarity that told her he was sent. "You don't know what you started," he said, voice low and without flourish. She kept walking, pretending she had not heard him, though the words reverberated in her bones. Threats must be parsed. Sometimes they were bluster. Sometimes they were the exact diagnostics of intent. She learned to treat each as both. Other times, the retaliation cut deeper. Petty extortion attempts from men seeking to turn fear into profit. Anonymous calls in dead hours that left her frozen. A bouquet of dead roses placed on a stoop with a card she didn't open because some things are better left unread. These acts were both message and ritual, the mob asserting that no betrayal could go unpunished without a public ledger of shame. There were worse things. A former associate's body was found in a parked car, and it was not the brutality of the murder that shook the neighborhood. It was the deliberate symbolism. His hands were bound, his face left visible like a lesson framed. People connected dots. Who had talked? Who had been useful to law enforcement? How connections had frayed. The body became a cautionary tale in flesh, a stark exhibit that caused even the most hardened to avert their eyes. Each time, Arlyne trembled. She felt the gravity of what she had done and knew there was no undoing it. She did not believe in heroism for what she'd given up. She had traded one kind of moral desert for another. The men she had helped put behind bars were human, with families and regrets. The systems she'd aided could sometimes fail those same families. She wrestled privately with that contradiction, morally ambiguous, but anchored in the practical need to protect her child. At the same time, law enforcement's success painted her as both asset and target. The more visible the indictments, the more the mob's fury concentrated. Names on mugshots became enemies with faces that the Underworld had a vested interest in erasing from the chessboard. Her role in that chain made her central to a story of retribution. As the years stretched, she grew more careful, more brittle. She no longer expected absolution from anyone. Consolation came in the form of small victories, a successful relocation plan, a new school for her daughter where no one knew the old stories, a quiet apartment with curtains that shut out the outside world. But these were not triumphs. They were accommodations born of necessity. The psychological cost remained. Sleep was thin, and the mind carved new pathways to survive. She rehearsed deaths quietly, sometimes imagining the worst so that it would be less shocking if it came. She took pleasure in small, defiant acts, a late-night city walk where she chose the route on whim, a plate of pasta eaten in a cheap diner where no one asked questions. These were rebellions, not against the men who hunted her, but against the idea that fear could own the rest of her life. In the courts, when trials finally unfolded, she sat behind a screen in a dim room, her voice filtered and recorded for posterity. Testimonies were read, cross-examinations carved at the truth, and juries decided the fates of men who had once been gods in cufflinks. Each guilty verdict was a relief wrapped in ash. Justice, for all its power, felt like a patch on a wound that would never fully close. When the dust settled, some of the old guards were gone. Others retreated into shadows where the law could not reach them. The underworld reshaped itself, older patterns yielding to younger ones who had watched the carnage and learned new lessons about loyalty and silence. For Arlyne, the shift offered no solace. New threats replaced old ones, and the world remained a place where power exacted its toll. In the quiet moments between chaos, she would sometimes whisper to herself, not as justification, but as a kind of truth, "I did this for my child." It was a small, stubborn mantra. It did not erase the nights she woke from nightmares, or the times she felt the weight of lives altered by her choices. But it was a compass, imperfect, human, and real. The fallout from betrayal is not a single event. It is an ongoing consequence that rearranges the landscape of your life. Arlyne learned this the hard way. Fame in the underworld is fire, and survival is the cool, long work of moving through shadows without being consumed by them. She stayed alive by outlasting the heat, by finding new patterns of movement, by trading the rush of power for the steadier, duller rhythm of protection. Marked for death, she lived anyway. It was a life stitched from fear and ferocity, from small mercies and quiet refusals. It was the life of a woman who had once wanted the world's respect and had traded for it a price she would carry forever. There are women who haunt places the way fog haunts harbor towns, quiet, persistent, and impossible to confront directly. By the time Arlyne Brickman reached her 50s, she had become one of those women, a presence folded into the city's memory, a name that still made older men lower their voices. She existed in the margins now, a ghost among the very streets that once fed her hunger for power. Life after the raids and the headlines was a study in erasure. The bright dresses and sharp suits were gone, replaced by plain coats and shoes that didn't attract attention. She learned to blend in the way people learn a new language, awkwardly at first, then with a mechanical fluency. Her new days were not glamorous. They were appointments, numbers, check-ins, meet the handler, attend court via a booth, whisper answers to questions that would make headlines or not, depending on the whim of a prosecutor. Her nights were quieter but heavier. Sleep didn't come easily to someone who had been hunted for years. She moved through neighborhoods she'd known every alley of, and they felt unfamiliar, altered by time and the small betrayals of progress. Old stoops had new paint. Corner bars were replaced by boutiques. Young men with open collars and loud watches swaggered on blocks where silence had once reigned. The city had been remade, but its bones were the same. Power, greed, and prey simply assumed new faces and new languages. Arlyne watched the changes from a distance, like someone leafing through an old photo album and trying not to touch the tears. She saw new generations of players, slicker, more cautious, secretly more ruthless because they had studied the downfall of their predecessors and learned defensive tricks. They had different rules, new markets, and a nastier appetite. The methods had evolved, but the hunger remained. In that sense, the story of the Mafia, or any criminal empire, was less a history than a cycle. Being forgotten was both a mercy and a curse. On clear days, when the sky over the East River was a hard, honest blue, she felt gratitude that her daughter could walk to school without anyone shouting a name in warning. On evenings, when rain smudged the city lights into something softer and sadder, she felt the weight of erasure like ash in her hands. She had wanted notoriety once. She had wanted to belong. Now she wanted nothing more than safety, and it humiliated her to want such ordinary things. Sometimes the past intruded like a cold draft. A grocery clerk might mention almost shyly a mugshot from years back. "Aren't you?" Heads would turn. Conversations that once hummed with laughter cut off like snapped wire. The old friends who remained were careful. Civility without affection. Contact without commitment. There were condolences that felt like insults. You did what you had to do. What they meant was, you did what made us safe. Those words never wrapped right in her mouth. She took to walking at night, moving through neighborhoods while the city slept and the lights wrote long, thin shadows. Those midnight walks were her confession and her interrogation. She would trace the root of a past deal in her head, imagine the faces she'd betrayed, and try to map the moral topography of her choices. The answers when they came were never clean. Guilt and relief braided themselves together. She had saved her child and sacrificed years of peace. She had seen men hauled into custody and had watched families shudder. Justice had a face that did not always match her own idea of justice. Old wounds had a way of ache reopening. Sometimes she would chance a visit to a park bench where she and her daughter once fed pigeons, and she would remember lullabies sung in a voice soaked with cigarette smoke and tenderness. She would feel the sting of almost forgotten laughter, the measure of small, stolen joys that had kept her afloat. Those memories were her anchors, proof that amid the wreckage something good had been born. People remembered her in different colors. To an FBI investigator, she'd been uncanny courage and usefulness. To a prosecutor, a key witness who changed the game. To the underworld, a lesson in what happened when faith was misapplied. But to her daughter, she was simply Mom, a woman who made school lunches, smoothed hair before bed, and had a voice that hummed like a lullaby, even when she had been the most dangerous person in the room. That was the life she had chosen to protect, and that thought softened even the coldest of her regrets. Occasionally, strangers approached her, not with menace, rarely with that bluntness now, but with curiosity wrapped in caution. An old neighbor once stopped her on the street and said, "You were brave, you know." The word startled her. Brave was not a label she'd worn comfortably. "I was scared," she said instead, and the neighbor nodded as if it explained everything. Another time, an elderly woman in a laundromat said simply, "You gave us back something." Those fragments of gratitude were small, fragile ordnance. They did not erase pain, but they soothed for a night. There were also nights of fear that refused to loosen their grip. New players sometimes sent smoke signals, a former associate's sudden disappearance, an anonymous envelope containing a photograph of her daughter's school taken from across the street. Those days she would sleep on a couch with a phone in her hand and an agent's number memorized. The world of protection was uneven and sometimes incompetent, but it was all she had. She learned the bitter arithmetic of surviving. Live cautiously, trust rarely, measure words like currency. Legal battles and courtrooms were a different kind of theater. She sat behind screens during trials, a voice filtered and mangled by radio equipment, because they had to protect her identity from the public and from those who would relish revenge. She watched as juries deliberated and judges offered sentences that were supposed to be moral correctives. Guilty verdicts were small triumphs, but they were always undercut by the realization that punishment could never stitch a hurt into a shape that looked like redemption. What she did had consequences both practical and spiritual, and the courts addressed only one slice. Media attention had long since waned, but the odd documentary or book would resurrect the story in new terms. Writers and filmmakers would try to turn her life into tidy arcs, but the truth resisted tidy lines. It was messy and contradictory. A woman who sought power and found danger, who used seduction as a tool and believed in something like justice, who protected a child and broke, in the process, dozens of other lives. She could read those articles and feel strangely disconnected, as if watching a ghostly dramatization of a woman she sometimes met in the mirror. As the years passed, time softened some edges. The mobs reconstituted, moved on, adapted. Their leaders aged or were replaced. Violence descended in new shapes. Yet the basic human arithmetic of greed and need continued. Arlyne felt no triumph in their persistence. If anything, she felt fatigue for the city, for the cycle, for the fact that human appetite never seemed to learn. And then there were the quiet, strange honors that arrive when history does not have a single verdict. Scholars and journalists would call, sometimes seeking interviews now that the danger had cooled. Young writers wanted to understand the moral calculus of a woman who betrayed an empire from within. She spoke rarely, not out of silence, but from weariness. When she did talk, it was in fragments, a mix of apology and explanation, anger and faded pride. It was not a manifesto. It was the accounting of a life that had to be made sense of in small, private terms. When her daughter grew into adulthood, the world shifted again. The daughter made choices unburdened by some of the past's direct dangers, a job, a partner, a life in a city that did not ask her daily to look over her shoulder. Those ordinary milestones were gifts, and Arlyne took them like a penitent taking communion. Grateful, a little surprised, and deeply relieved. Late at night, in the quiet house that had become a sanctuary rather than a stage, she would sometimes stand with a cup of tea and listen to the city breathe. The lights across the river blinked in polite observance. The ghosts were there, but they had become companions rather than tormentors. She moved through the remaining years with a careful grace, aware of the price she had paid and the small mercies she had earned. Arlyne Brickman did not become a saint. She did not expect absolution. What she became was a lesson, one that read differently depending on who told it. To some she was a traitor, to others a necessary instrument. To herself, she was a woman who had loved a world that would never love her back and who, at great cost, tore a piece of it down so that another generation might breathe a little easier. The Ice Queen survived, then faded, an ember in the city's endless, hungry night. But embers sometimes start new fires, and sometimes they simply glow steady and quiet. She chose, in the end, to be the latter, unremarkable to most eyes, necessary to the history books, and quietly human in moments when no one else was looking. There's a strange kind of silence that follows a storm. Not peace, but a hollow echo, as though the world itself is catching its breath. That was the sound that filled Arlyne Brickman's later years. The mob had changed, her name had faded from the headlines, and the danger that once shadowed every step had dulled to a background hum. But the echoes of her choices, the ones that had reshaped not only her life but the fates of dozens of others, still lingered. They followed her like ghosts that refused to be buried. She lived quietly, in a small apartment overlooking a street that never really slept. The city's rhythm, the hum of cars, the distant sirens, the faint laughter rising from the sidewalks below, had become her lullaby. Once that same noise had been the soundtrack to her rise, to her late-night dealings and smoky backroom conversations. Now it was a reminder of the world she had escaped, and the one she could never fully return to. Every morning she'd sit by the window with her coffee, watching people hurry to jobs, families rushing to schools, lovers stealing moments before the day swallowed them whole. She wondered if they knew how fragile it all was, how easily one choice, one whispered name, one betrayal could unravel everything they took for granted. That thought stayed with her, not as bitterness, but as a quiet observation born of experience. The newspapers no longer wrote about her. The law no longer called her in for testimony. Even the men who once wanted her dead had either died themselves or grown too old and tired to care. The game had moved on. The new generation of criminals didn't even know her name. Or if they did, it was only as a line in a book, a passing mention of a woman who had once been both a friend and a weapon to the mob. Time had washed away the fear, leaving behind something stranger, anonymity. But anonymity did not erase memory, and Arlyne had a lifetime of them. Sometimes she would find herself lost in reverie, a voice, a smell, a photograph in a drawer pulling her backward. The laughter of a man in a bar would remind her of a capo she once charmed for information. The glint of gold on someone's wrist would stir a flash of the gaudy nights when she glittered beneath chandeliers, the mob's ice queen wrapped in fur and diamonds. And then she'd remember the crackle of the wire hidden beneath those same gowns, the recorder that hummed quietly against her skin as she betrayed the very world that had given her a name. There was no way to reconcile those versions of herself, the woman who had once been feared and the woman who had later been used. She had been both sinner and savior, predator and prey, a paradox of survival. But in the solitude of her twilight years, she stopped trying to reconcile them. Instead, she learned to sit with them, the ghosts, the memories, the contradictions, like old friends around a table. There was no redemption there, only recognition. Her daughter, grown now, visited often. She had children of her own, 2 small lives that ran through the apartment, filling it with the kind of laughter Arlyne thought she'd never hear again. Watching them was both joy and punishment. She loved them fiercely, yet every time she looked at them she was reminded of the price she had paid so they could live in a world without fear. It was the purest kind of love, one that had been carved out of guilt. On some nights, after her daughter tucked the grandchildren in, Arlyne would pour herself a glass of wine and sit with her in the living room, the two of them bathed in the glow of the television, usually playing some documentary or crime story. Occasionally, her daughter would glance at her when the show mentioned informants or witness protection. The air would grow heavy, but neither of them would speak about it. Their silence was mutual understanding, an acknowledgement of what was too complicated for words. Arlyne knew her daughter loved her, but she also knew that love carried the faint, unspoken ache of everything they had lost. There were moments when the FBI still called, not for testimony, but for check-ins. Old habits die hard in government files. Sometimes they asked if she still felt safe, if she had noticed anything unusual. She always gave the same answer: "I'm fine." The truth was, she didn't know if safety existed anymore, not in the way ordinary people understood it. Safety, to her, wasn't about being unthreatened. It was about being ready when the threat came. You didn't live through what she had and ever truly relax again. Every now and then, a journalist would send a letter. Most were ignored. But once, out of curiosity, she agreed to a short interview with a young woman from a college paper. The girl had eyes like fire. Curious, idealistic, the way Arlyne once had been before the world carved its lessons into her. "Do you regret it?" the girl asked, voice trembling slightly. Arlyne studied her for a long time before answering. "Regret," she said finally, "is just a different kind of prison. You can live there if you want, but it won't change the sentence." The girl blinked, unsure if that was wisdom or warning. Maybe it was both. That was the thing about Arlyne in her later years. She had grown philosophical, not softer. She didn't believe in absolutes anymore. Good and evil were convenient words used by people who had never had to choose between their child's life and their own conscience. Morality, she thought, was elastic. It stretched as far as necessity demanded. Sometimes late at night she would walk down to the pier and stare out at the black water. The city lights shimmered across the surface, bending with each ripple, like memories that refused to stay still. She would think about the men she'd loved, the gangsters, the liars, the dreamers, and wonder if any of them had ever truly understood her. Probably not. They had loved the version of her that fit into their world. The glamorous, reckless Arlyne who could drink them under the table and smile like sin. None of them had known the part of her that prayed every night for her daughter's safety while hiding a gun under the pillow. She would light a cigarette, one of the few vices she hadn't given up, and take slow drags, watching the ember flare against the night. The smoke curled upward, ghostly and soft, vanishing into the air. It reminded her of herself, how once she had burned so brightly, and now she existed only as a trace of something that used to matter. In those moments, she sometimes allowed herself to feel proud. She had outlived the mob's wrath, outlasted her enemies, and carved a second life from the wreckage of the first. That took more than luck. It took defiance, a stubborn refusal to let anyone, not even death, dictate her ending. But pride was fleeting. Regret always returned, not as guilt, but as a whisper. At what cost? There was a story she liked to tell, though she never admitted if it was true. In the years after her testimony, she once received a letter. No return address, no name. Inside was a single photograph, her younger self in a red dress, laughing at some long-forgotten party. Across the back, scrawled in uneven handwriting, were 3 words. "You did right." She never knew who sent it. Maybe it was someone from law enforcement, maybe a friend from the old days, maybe just a stranger who saw her story as something noble. But she kept that photograph in a drawer by her bedside until the day she died. By then, she had made her peace, not with the world, but with herself. She stopped fearing the ghosts because, in a way, she had become one of them. Invisible, misunderstood, but still present in the city's bloodstream. The mob had its legends, Capone, Gotti, Luciano, but none of them had done what she did. None had turned against the machine and lived to tell the tale. That in itself made her story worth remembering. When people in the old neighborhoods whispered her name now, it was with a strange mixture of contempt and awe. They called her the Ice Queen, not because of cruelty, but because of the calm, deliberate way she had dismantled the empire from within. She had done what no one thought possible. She had beaten the Mafia at its own game, not with bullets, but with words, with courage, with betrayal. And yet, she never saw herself as a hero. Heroes sleep soundly. Arlyne never did. In the end, the reckoning wasn't in a courtroom, or in the streets, or in the papers. It was in the quiet moments, the reflection of a woman who had lived too much, loved too hard, and broken too many rules to fit neatly into anyone's definition of right or wrong. It was the realization that survival isn't victory, but it's the closest thing to it that the damned ever get. When the Ice Queen finally passed away, the world barely noticed. No headlines, no ceremonies, just a small obituary in the back of a paper. Arlyne Brickman, 83, passed quietly in her sleep. She is survived by her daughter and grandchildren. But somewhere, in the depths of the city she once ruled from the shadows, an old bartender poured a glass of scotch, set it on the counter and whispered, "To the Queen." And for a brief, flickering moment, the ghosts of the underworld raised their glasses too. The courtroom was no place for saints. Yet on that morning in 1985, it shimmered with a strange kind of divinity, a spotlight of truth cutting through the fog of corruption. Arlyne Brickman, the woman once known in Little Italy as the mob's ice queen, sat beneath that light. Her hands were folded tightly on her lap, trembling just enough to betray the storm raging inside her. The same woman who once cruised Mulberry Street in a Cadillac with mob princes now stood as a key witness for the government, the enemy. The silence that hung over the room wasn't respect. It was venom. Every pair of eyes from the defense benches drilled into her, burning holes in the thin wall of courage she had built. The prosecutors had prepped her for this moment for weeks. They told her to stay calm, to breathe, to remember she was doing the right thing. But what they couldn't prepare her for was the look in the eyes of the men she once called friends, those same eyes that once sparkled over a glass of scotch now filled with murder. Sammy Gravano, Anthony Scotto, and the others sat still, their suits crisp, their expressions unreadable. But she knew what they were thinking. Betrayal. And for a world built on loyalty, betrayal was worse than death. The prosecutor began his questions slowly, giving Arlyne room to find her rhythm. He asked about her connections, the late-night meetings, the drug runs, the money laundering, the whispers in the dark corners of restaurants and bars. She answered with a voice that trembled at first, but grew steadier with every word. Each sentence was a cut, each memory a piece of her past ripped away and exposed to the world. The courtroom scribes could barely keep up with the names she dropped, the places she described, the methods she revealed. It was like peeling back the skin of the Mafia itself, showing the machinery of crime that had operated unseen for decades. But then came the defense attorney, a shark in a tailored suit who smelled blood in her fear. He didn't go for the facts, he went for her soul. "Ms. Brickman," he began, pacing before the jury like a man conducting a performance. "You were no innocent woman, were you? You weren't forced into this life. You wanted it, the money, the excitement, the power. You liked being close to dangerous men, didn't you?" Arlyne met his gaze, unflinching. "I liked being seen," she replied. "In my world, women were invisible unless they stood next to someone powerful. I wanted to matter." The courtroom stirred, whispers rippling through the rows. The lawyer smirked, sensing the moment. "And now you matter again. You're famous, aren't you? The woman who betrayed the mob. Tell me, Ms. Brickman, is this your second chance at fame?" The jab landed hard, but Arlyne didn't look away. "If fame means saving my daughter from what I became," she said, her voice low but steady, "then yes, I'll take it." The jury sat frozen. The defense lawyer had no clever retort for that. For the first time, the mask of the Ice Queen cracked, not out of weakness, but out of truth. Outside the courtroom, the media circus spun like wildfire. Reporters shouted her name, flashbulbs exploded, and headlines called her everything from hero to rat. FBI agents escorted her in and out, watching the rooftops and shadows for any sign of retaliation. Every day she testified was another day she risked her life. Every truth she spoke chipped away at the fortress of silence the Mafia had built over generations. But the danger didn't end in the courtroom. Even the agents knew that once a woman like Arlyne crossed the line, there was no going back. The Mafia had a long memory, and vengeance was part of its DNA. The FBI offered her relocation, a new identity, a chance to vanish, but she refused. She wanted her daughter to grow up knowing who she was, not hiding from the ghosts of her past. When the verdict finally came, the courtroom held its breath. The jury foreman stood, hands shaking as he read out the words, "Guilty." One after another, the mobsters were convicted: racketeering, conspiracy, extortion. The empire she had once admired was crumbling from within, and she was the dynamite that started it. But victory, for Arlyne, was a strange and lonely thing. As she left the courthouse, reporters surrounded her, shouting questions. "Do you feel safe? Do you regret what you did? What happens now, Ms. Brickman?" She paused, looking at the sea of cameras and microphones. The winter air bit through her coat, and for the first time in a long while, she let herself smile. Not the cold smirk of the Ice Queen, but something softer. "What happens now?" she said quietly. "Now I try to live." That night she sat in her apartment, the city lights flickering beyond the window. The trial was over, but the weight of what she'd done pressed down harder than ever. She had torn apart the very family she once craved to be part of. Her phone didn't ring anymore, No one came to visit, and even her daughter looked at her with a kind of cautious reverence, proud but scared. Arlyne poured herself a drink, something she hadn't done in months, and stared at her reflection in the glass. The woman looking back wasn't the glamorous mob mistress of her youth, nor the frightened informant whispering in FBI corridors. She was something new, something forged in betrayal and survival. The city outside buzzed like always, indifferent to her story. But somewhere out there, men were still talking, still plotting, still remembering the woman who had dared to break Omerta, and Arlyne knew that she would never be safe. Not truly, not in this life. Still, she didn't regret it. Because in her own twisted way, she had finally beaten the system that used her. The Mafia had promised her belonging, protection, identity, but it had only ever given her fear. By turning on them, she had taken back her voice. A week later, a small package arrived at her door. No return address. Inside, a single rose, black and wilted. No note, no signature. Just a reminder that the past doesn't die quietly. Arlyne stared at it for a long moment, then tossed it into the fireplace. The petals curled and hissed as the flames consumed them. "Not tonight," she whispered. Not anymore. In the years that followed, her name would fade from headlines, replaced by new scandals, new betrayals. But for those who knew the streets, who remembered the old codes of silence and power, Arlyne Brickman's name remained legend. The woman who turned the mob inside out. The Ice Queen who melted her own empire to save what little of her soul was left. She lived quietly, always looking over her shoulder, always listening for footsteps in the dark. Some say she changed her name and moved to another state. Others believe she stayed right where she was, daring them to come for her. No one really knows. But the story of her testimony, of that cold electric courtroom where a woman stood up to the most feared men in America, became part of the city's folklore. And if you walk down certain streets in Little Italy, old-timers will still whisper about her. Some curse her name, some nod with respect, but all of them remember. Because in a world ruled by fear and silence, one woman's voice had been loud enough to break the spell,